Hi there, my name is Caitlin Bandy and this is my channel Bandy's Books, and today I am here to do my May wrap up. So May was kind of an interesting month for me. I predominantly read books for Asian American Pacific Islander month and for Mental Health Awareness month. I didn't get to read quite as much in May as I typically would. I was maybe shy of my normal number by like 5 books. And that's just because I had a whole ton of medical appointments and just a lot going on getting ready for this big surgery that I had in the middle of May. And then I had my big operation May 13th, and that first week post-op, I probably could have read had I forced myself, but I just didn't feel like it. I felt like I needed just a complete break, a physical break, a mental break, everything to just kind of rest and recover. And so I just basically spent that week zoning out and not really reading much. I did finish one book that week for the BookTube prize, but other than that, I was like, I'm just gonna take it easy on myself. I think that was the best thing I could do because I'm recovering really well, I'm feeling rested, and it has led me to feel really excited about June. So that being said, let's jump into some statistics and then I will tell you how I felt about each of the books that I read. So for the month of May, I read 18 books in total. That broke down to 5,952 pages, and that averaged to about 325 pages per book. In terms of nonfiction to fiction, this was my worst month for nonfiction this year. I only finished one nonfiction book, which is about 6% of my reading for the month. I have been doing a lot better this year, averaging like 3 books a month. So a little bit slower this month, but that's okay. In terms of pages per book, 44% of my books were under 300 pages this month, and 56% of my books were between 300 to 500 pages. And I had no books this month that were over 500 pages. This is definitely the lowest page per book average that I've had in the entire year so far. The longest book that I read was The Water Outlaws at 484 pages. The shortest book that I read was Everything Calls for Salvation at 184 pages. And my top 5 genres were literary fiction, historical fiction, fantasy, LGBTQIA books, and thrillers. So I am pleased to say that in the month of May, I had no 2-star reads. That is always a good feeling when the books are enjoyable. I did have a couple of 3 stars, so we're gonna dive into those first. So the first of my 3 stars was The Mystery at Dunvegan Castle by T.L. Huchu. This is the 3rd book in the Library of the Dead series, and it was kind of the same as the rest of the series for me. It was enjoyable enough. I didn't mind reading it. I didn't feel bad about reading it, but it's not a series that I would like continue forward if there was 7 books in the series. I think for me, it's probably just the right amount that it's ending after the 3rd book. There are some interesting aspects of it. I really like the school system that's set up. Our main character is interesting, and the like paranormal ghost structure is kind of cool, but I feel like there's a lot of things that are left unexplained. I think that the stories between the 3 books get a little bit repetitive, kind of the same sort of structure over and over and over again. Not horrible, but not great. My second 3-star read was Severance by Ling Ma. This is kind of a dystopian fiction. The world comes to a crashing halt, and our main character is one of the few survivors. She joins with a band of other survivors, and it quickly becomes like borderline like a cult. This had some really interesting things going on in it as well. I like that there's this cult dynamic that sort of develops, and I like that our main character kind of fights back and is trying to determine what's right for herself. I also think the concept for what happened in the world was really unique, but this is another book where I felt like there's a lot of loose ends. Things aren't really explained very thoroughly. There's a lot of guesswork involved. Some of the characters were really hard for me. Just overall, there were things that worked really well and things that worked really not so well, and so it kind of just averaged out to a middle range book for me. The next of my 3-star reads is one that I am so disappointed to put here, and that is Land of Milk and Honey by Zhang. This is a dystopian fiction that is focused on food scarcity and climate change. We have a main character who is a chef. I was so excited about that. And she's working in this world of food scarcity. She really doesn't have much work anymore. And then she gets hired by this like ultra elite private society to cook with like exotic ingredients. In my mind, I thought this was going to be really critical of like the access of the wealthy to import exotic ingredients while the masses are starving. I thought it would have sharp commentary on like climate change, on food scarcity, on all these different things, and none of that really came to be. It wasn't even about the chef and the cooking. Like, I was so excited for a story that had good representation of a chef, and instead it was this really weird literary experimental sort of a thing where it's like all a performance and an act, and it just went in a really weird direction. And it's funny because I saw a couple different reviews of this book by people that I'm usually pretty in line with on opinions. And every once in a while we'll have something that's different. And I thought this would be the book that we would be different on. I thought for sure, like, oh, I'm gonna get it because I'm a chef, I'm in the food industry. Nope, this book just isn't that good. It is something that could have been an extraordinarily sharp critique had it been handled correctly, and it was honestly just fumbled. I debated about giving it a 2-star, but there were a couple aspects that were like, I think it at least deserves a 3-star. I managed to get through it. I was interested enough to keep reading it at a couple points. And yeah, I really wish this had been handled better. My fourth 3-star read was My Cat Yugoslavia by Pajtim Statovici. Sorry if I've butchered that name. This book, it was like an acid trip, and at points I felt like it was saying some poignant things, but I didn't feel smart enough to catch all of what it was trying to say. We have multi-different POVs. We have a young woman who's getting married into a family, and we see her very abusive and non-traditional relationship with her husband and the family dynamic. And then we have another gentleman who's living in an apartment and dating a cat. So like the cat, I think, is anthropomorphized. It was very bizarre. I responded well to the woman's story and like her troubles with her husband and the life that she ends up with. But the secondary story about the young gentleman who's living with the cat, I really didn't get it. I feel like there was probably some commentary on post-Soviet countries and like government, politics, and social structures, but either I'm not familiar enough with it or just not sharp enough to pick up on what the commentary was. I know that some of the other people that read this book enjoyed it more than I did. I just felt lost through a large portion of it. And now onto my 4-star reads. My first 4-star read was Bodies of Light by Jennifer Downs. This was the group read for Misery May, which is hosted by Gemma at Gemma Books and Scott at Gunpowder Fiction and Plot. This is a readathon that is focused on miserable books. That is the goal, is to read really sad, snot-inducing reads. And this was picked for the group read. This is also a book that I have seen recommended by Scott previously as being really good, really poignant, and also very depressing. So I'm all in for it. I thought that this was pretty well done. I really liked like 95% of the book. I thought the ending of it was kind of like a little bit rushed. I wish that it had been handled a little bit more delicately. But overall, I think that this was a good reflection on somebody who has just a really troubled life. We kind of see how this character in the book is victimized as a child and then continues to be victimized throughout her adult life, and even at points kind of participates in high-risk activities. I will say that at the end, I almost felt a little like overwhelmed. I started to get like, is this gonna verge into that trauma porn category? I don't think that it quite went there. I think that this was more of a realistic portrayal of what somebody who just has one of these types of lives is like. It's a lot of bad luck, bad circumstances, and then this chronic victimization. So I thought that that was well handled. I thought that overall it was pretty like delicately written. I just, again, like that ending was just a little bit more rushed than I would have liked. I think if the ending had just been a little smoother and a little bit more time to kind of take in what's happening to her in the last little bits, it could have been a 5-star read for me. Then I had The Water Outlaws by S.L. Huang. So this book is about a female general, and she works for this king. She is the trainer of all of the military. She's really well respected. She's very strict and stern. She takes her job incredibly seriously, and she's very loyal to the king. At one point, her commanding officer attempts to sexually assault her, and she is put into a predicament that eventually costs her her job. He accuses her of trying to sabotage the king, and then she's originally going to be executed, but eventually is instead exiled. During that exile, she is broken free and eventually comes to live with this group of female nuns. And the story kind of goes from there. It is about this group of nuns and what they're doing in their country, how they're kind of fighting back against the system, and how they're protecting each other. This was a really good book. I enjoyed it quite a bit. This is the start of a series, I believe, and I'm really looking forward to seeing where the series goes from where it left off. I found the characters really interesting. I thought it was really rich. I thought the action was done pretty well. My only critique of this book really is that at times it just felt a little overlong. This was one that I think you could have done a little bit of, trimming down to make it a better and more efficient book, but it's a pretty minor issue. I think that if book 2 is really good, this could turn into a series that I really, really enjoy. Next up, I have The Leftover Woman by Kwok. So this is a multi-POV story. We have one main character who is a woman from China who had to give up her daughter. She comes to the United States and she has to put herself in all of these risky positions, doing whatever she can to make enough money to try to find her daughter. And then we have this white family in the United States who could not have a baby of their own, and so they've adopted a daughter from China. Now, these two stories kind of intertwine, and they go in a direction that seems pretty obvious. It's pretty clear who each of these women is and where the story is going to conclude. But then it takes a couple twists that keep it a little bit interesting. And what I really appreciated is the way that Kwok handled both of these women. Neither woman is left unscathed by the story. Like, they both make decisions that are questioned, but ultimately, you come to realize that both of these women are not bad women. They're women in a specific type of circumstance doing the best that they can. So I really appreciated that. I feel like it was realistic and it handled each of those storylines pretty well. I found some of the characters hard to deal with. I found some of the choices maybe slightly unrealistic, and the ending for me was a little bit kind of over the top. But it's minor. Again, I thought overall this was pretty well written. Had the ending, I think, been just a little bit tighter, I would have liked it a little bit better, but a solid 4. Then I had A Burning by Megha Majumdar. So this was a book that I picked up for Misery May, and this was a pretty miserable book. We have 3 characters. We have a young girl who is originally from the slums in India, and she's just determined that she is going to make it. She's going to get an education. She's going to get out and better her life. And then she's accused of a terrorist attack on a train. She goes through a trial, and basically she is decided guilty without much evidence. We have a gentleman who is formerly her teacher who gains some political notoriety and has the potential to be able to save her, but instead wants to further his political position, and so he uses her case for clout. And then we have a third woman who has dreams of being a Bollywood actress. She has kind of these delusions of grandeur, but she's also the only witness that could save the first woman from being executed. And this really focuses on like the lead up to the trial, and then the after effects. This is a hard book to read. It's frustrating throughout. There are multiple points you're just like, oh, this shouldn't be happening this way. I felt a lot of righteous indignity for our characters at the end, and a lot of anger towards one of the characters as well. It was pretty well written. It's hard because I know why the book ended the way it did, but I wanted a little more out of it, I guess. I also felt at points a little bit emotionally detached throughout the story, and that might have just been me where I was when I was reading it. I expected to feel a little bit more deeply emotional about it, and somehow I felt kind of a disconnect in places. But I do think it was well written. I do really appreciate the 3 stories and how they wove in and out of each other. I think the author handled the subject matter very delicately. So if you're looking for a miserable book, this is definitely a miserable book, but in all the good ways. Then I read The Ghost Bride by Yangtze Choo. So I read her book, The Fox Wife, like a month or 2 ago and really enjoyed that. My mom had a copy of The Ghost Bride and sent it over to me, and she thought that I would probably enjoy this. I did end up enjoying it quite a bit. This focuses on a young woman. Her father has been widowed, and he's kind of basically failed to really take care of her. Like, he keeps her from starving, but he doesn't do his duties as a father and try to arrange a successful marriage for his daughter. And so she's kind of left with no prospects at marriage, no prospects at stability, a father who's penniless and can't support her. And so she's then offered a very unusual marriage with a really wealthy family. And that marriage is for her to be a ghost bride to their dead son. In 1893 Malaya, this is a practice that happens but is really unusual and rare, and it's even considered to be somewhat of an insult to the person you're offering it to. So our main character is struggling with the potential financial security if she chooses to be a ghost bride versus the things that she really wants in life. There's a paranormal element of the story. I thought this was really interesting. I liked a lot of this book. I think that parts of it got a little bit chaotic, especially towards the end. I think that I would have liked to know a little bit more about the tradition of being a ghost bride. Like, the story kind of seems like it assumes that you know what that means and like what that entails, how that came to be, and just starts going. And I guess as somebody who had never heard of a ghost bride prior to this book, I would have liked maybe just a little bit more info on it. Overall, I thought it was really well done. This has, like I said, a paranormal element. There's some magical realism in it. I think that Choo frequently likes to incorporate magical realism elements, and I do think that she handles them pretty well. So a really interesting book. I learned about a tradition I hadn't heard of before, and I will probably be reading Choo's The Night Tiger soon. That's the last book I think I have of hers that I haven't read yet. And my final 4-star read was The Wild and Distant Seas by Tara Karr Roberts. So this was a book that I got through NetGalley. I was a little bit late getting to reviewing it, so I just wanted to catch up on it. This is a book that is inspired by Moby Dick. So we have a woman, she is working in this inn, she's really famous for her chowders, and then Ishmael, the character from Moby Dick, ends up coming into the hotel where she works. They have a torrid affair one night in the rain, and she ends up pregnant. Ishmael leaves, never to be seen again, and she's left to bear this child and to continue to run this hotel and keep things stable. And then the book continues from there by following each progressive generation of women from this pregnancy by Ishmael. And there's this kind of like longing in each of these women to know their origin, to know Ishmael, to know if, you know, they ever caught the great white whale and like what became of that side of their lineage. There's not really like hostility or animosity at him for not being there, but just more like this general curiosity. And so it's kind of interesting because it doesn't really ever address the story of Moby Dick. It just kind of hints at it occasionally. And incorporates it like in and out of the story. But I thought that a lot of these various progressions of the family lineage were really interesting. Where they all ended up was pretty cool. I think that the thing that stopped this from being a 5-star read for me was like the last maybe third of the book started to get really strange. I think like the first 3 characters or so, I really enjoyed their perspectives, really was interested in what happened to them. And it's just like that last one was kind of bizarre, and I don't know, it just kind of threw the book off for me a little bit. But overall, I thought this was pretty well written, and other people might like the ending a little better than I did. I think it was a solid 4-star, and I actually didn't realize that it had to do with Moby Dick. So when I started reading it and they started referencing Moby Dick, I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna get this. I've never read Moby Dick. I'm not super into classics. So I was kind of dreading it, and I ended up enjoying it quite a bit. And now we're gonna jump into the 5-star reads. I had a good handful this month and they were really enjoyable, so let's talk about it. So my first 5-star read is The Tea Girl of Hummingbird Lane by Lisa C. So I think Lisa C is gonna be an auto-buy author for me. I loved The Island of Sea Women. I loved Lady Tan's Circle of Women. Now I've loved this book. I feel like C does just such an impeccable job at researching whatever subject she decides to write about. This one is no exception. So this book follows a young girl who is from the Akha tribe. In this case, it's set in China, but from further research that I did, I found out that the Akha are in different regions of Asia, in parts of China, in Thailand, and in Myanmar. I think the largest population left of the Akha is in Thailand nowadays. So in this book, we have this young woman who grows up with this culture that's vastly different from ours. It's really interesting because initially we're seeing the village function based on their tribal rules. And there are things that to like the Western mind make no sense at all, but it's based on their traditions and the way that they've lived for all of these years. And so it's this really interesting look into life within this village and within this culture. I thought that was a really like gripping start to the book. And then this young woman goes through something that is very difficult and somewhat tragic, and it really shapes who she becomes as a woman. She's always exhibited a remarkable amount of intelligence. She's the best performing student at the local school. She's taught herself English, and she starts to learn how to negotiate business and kind of advocate for people. And then eventually she receives the opportunity to kind of get away from her tribe and experience the outer world. And so this is such an interesting book because we see her from the beginning, the culture that she grew up with, and then we see all of this growth and change, her move around the world, and then her return to the place that she started at. I just thought this was so well done. This character felt believable. This world felt believable. The things that happened in the world felt believable. Just everything about it is good. And again, C includes so much rich detail that these stories just really come to life. I won't say that this is my favorite book by C, but I do think that it was pretty remarkable. And in particular, I appreciate that it was about a culture that I was not at all familiar with. It taught me about a group of people that I hadn't honestly heard about before, and I think that it handled it pretty delicately. Next up, I have Dragonfruit by Makiia Lucier. Honestly, I am a bit surprised that this ended up being in the 5-star category for me. So this is a pretty nice fantasy standalone, but there is a pretty significant portion of this book that is a romance, and I am not somebody that typically enjoys romance. I'm not a romantasy reader. I like my fantasies to be epic in scope and not a lot of time for love, much more action and fighting and swashbuckling and stuff. This though was really well done. The author of this book grew up in Guam, and I feel like some of that Guamanian culture really resonated into this book. I felt like the way that the world was structured and the lifestyle on the island that our characters from, a lot of it really reminded me of Guamanian culture. Our main character is smart, thoughtful, conscientious of nature. Our main male character, the romantic lead, was healthy, he wasn't toxic, he communicated. It was the sweetest, most wholesome sort of a scenario. It was one of those things where I was like, if this was what romance was like, I could read this more often. It was nice to see two people communicate in a way that worked, in a way that was healthy for everybody, not, constant misunderstandings and intentional anger and hurt and things like that. So I thought it was really well done. There were some elements with dragons. There were these spirit animals that had to do with their tattoos, which I thought were really cool. It's just a really rich, fun book. That's what I can say about it. It just was really fun. I enjoyed this read. I sat down and read it in a day and a half. I didn't want to put it down. And for me, when I read a fantasy, that is a sign of a good fantasy to me, is when I don't want to put the book down. I mean, I guess that works for any type of book, but especially for fantasy. If I'm really invested in it, engaged with the story, I just want to keep reading. So if you like dragons and island life and a non-toxic romance, then definitely check this book out. Then I had The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon. So this was a book that I had left over from April. April was Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and so I had picked out a bunch of books that discussed sexual assault or had themes dealing with sexual assault. This was one of those books. I did not get a chance to get to it in April. I just ran out of time. And so I read it as my first book in May, and I'm really glad that I did. This was a fantastic historical fiction. It's set in Maine in 1789, and we have this main character named Martha, who is the town midwife and really the unofficial doctor. She deals with a lot of different things besides just midwifery. When a dead body is found in the local frozen river, she's called in to investigate the body and determine if it was an accidental drowning, a murder, a suicide. She determines that it is a murder, and it becomes complicated because the man who was murdered was also accused of sexually assaulting one of the women in town. And so she takes her finding to the local magistrate, and it is essentially hushed up. They call in some doctor specialist who comes in with a fancy title and says that she has no idea what she's talking about, she's not a medical professional, and that he, with his Harvard education, knows so much better than she does. And everything is just kind of swept under the rug. And this kind of begins Martha on this path of discovering just how corrupt her town's government is. I loved Martha as a main character. She was brilliant, she was clever, she was resilient, determined, strong. She advocates for her female patients. She's just everything that you admire in a female character. And this scenario that she's stuck in seems pretty realistic. Maybe the ending was slightly wishful thinking, but the rest of the story honestly felt so true to what we know of different points in history. I just really, really liked the way that this was handled. And for a book that discusses sexual assault as a pretty significant theme, I felt like it was really well balanced. There are definitely heavy moments within the story, but it doesn't feel heavy throughout the entire book. There is levity and lightness and romance and things that balance those deep, dark moments. Then I have Everything Calls for Salvation by Daniele Mencarelli. This was my shortest read of the month. You can see it is a tiny little book. So this is autofiction. It is about Daniele, and he wakes up in a psychiatric unit. He is on a 7-day hold. He vaguely remembers some of the stuff that had happened to him, but not in great detail. He's kind of trying to piece different things together, and it's a lot of his observations on the psychiatric unit, the people that are there, the doctors, the orderlies, all of that. it's also some musings about what's going on with him, his frustrations, you know, this medical system that keeps diagnosing him with different things. Every doctor wants to give him different medication. Nobody really has any answers, and nothing has really given him any lasting relief of his medical issues. This is a book that is sparse in its prose. It only says exactly what needs to be said. There is no like flowery, there's not really any floweriness. The description paints a very vivid picture of the people and the things that are happening. But it doesn't really go much farther than that. But I thought that simplicity in the writing actually made this a lot more poignant. It's direct, it's to the point, you know exactly what's happening. There's not a lot that's left up for interpretation. And I think it made it a really effective narrative. This was one of my picks for Mental Health Awareness Month, and I thought that this was a pretty good musing on mental health and the structure of the mental health system in Italy. Could be a little bit of a difficult read at points, but for the most part, I thought that there was some levity mixed in with, you know, the difficult subjects and themes that kind of kept the book from feeling super depressing. Definitely would recommend it. My final 5-star read was While You Were Out by Meg Kissinger, an intimate family portrait of mental illness in an era of silence. So Meg is one of 8 children, and she talks about life growing up. So 10 people in the family in total, 2 parents and then the kids. And everybody in the family is dealing with some sort of mental illness. 2 of her siblings end up killing themselves at a certain point in the story. And this is sort of Meg's reflection on like life growing up, her siblings' suicides, and then the family's response to everything. The main theme that she's focused on is how silence affects mental health. She talks about how her family was like almost embarrassed to be open about their mental health struggles, how they felt shame at their children having killed themselves, how they didn't talk about it, how, you know, there was stories about accidents and illnesses and things made up to cover up the fact that these 2 children had killed themselves, and how that is super detrimental. She talks about how other siblings continued to struggle with their mental health and how everything was just really, really hush-hush. It is a difficult book to read because obviously she's talking about so many different people with so many significant issues and trauma, and it isn't super straightforward. Like, you have a lot of understanding for why everyone is behaving the way they are, the time, the place that it's set in, and ultimately you feel a lot of sympathy for this family that's been marred by tragedy and then has continued to struggle in the aftermath of it. There are parts of this book that I really related to, and then there were parts that I had a really hard time relating to. But overall, I thought that this was really well written. I thought this was a really thoughtful reflection on her family's history, on what silence brought, and then I thought that it did a good job of advocating for destigmatizing mental health. I thought it did a good job of advocating for, you know, treating mental health the same way that we treat physical health, being able to converse about it and be factual. I think that this does a good job of advocating for people with mental health disorders. In general, I just thought it was a really well-written book. Will I say that this is the best memoir that I've read this year? No. But you're putting it up against books like Know My Name, where I don't know if any memoir could really stand up against that. But I will say that this is pretty well done. I think if you're looking for something that really delves deep into mental health issues, this is a book that you probably should read. At the end of the day, my average rating for books this month was a 4.06. That is pretty fantastic. That's actually the highest average I've had so far this year. And that is because I didn't have any 2 stars. I had very few 3 stars. Most of my books were in the 4 to 5 star range. So I'm very pleased with that. My favorite read of the month was While You Were Out by Meg Kissinger. Again, this was really poignant, and I thought it did a lot of really positive things in discussing mental health. My least favorite was probably obvious when I was talking about it, but it was Land of Milk and Honey by Pam C. Zhang. This was a huge disappointment. This book had so many elements that I loved. It was a book that I was rooting for. Even as I got to the end of it, I was still rooting for it, and it just was probably one of the more disappointing things I've read. Maybe that has to do with some of my expectations, but I also think that the writing wasn't as good as it could have been. So that is the end of my May wrap up. I hope that you've enjoyed hearing the stats and my reviews of the different books. Maybe you've added a couple things to your TBR or taken a few things off. Either way, hit the thumbs up if you liked the video and comment down below. Let me know if you've read any of these books, how you felt about them. Let me know what you read in May. How did you do? How many books did you get to? Let me know your favorites, your least favorites, whatever you want to share with me about May reading. I want to hear all about it. And if you're not already subscribed to this channel, you know what to do. Hit the subscribe button down below, as well as the notification bell so that you never miss a video. And that way we can see each other again soon. Thanks so much for joining. Bye.